Good morning to our mavens. Good morning, all. Welcome to our weekly Talmud Shiur. Today is Thursday, December 7th. Tonight, when the sun sets, we will kindle the first light on our Chanukah, our Chanukah menorah, and I hope that it will be a joyful holiday for all. I began this morning's class before starting the recording by announcing the sad and untimely death of Rabbi David Ellenson. Apparently died peacefully in his sleep. I have no further details about the circumstances of his death or the way in which he will be memorialized, but I know that it will be shared widely with the Reform Jewish and indeed the whole Jewish community. So we will find a way to honor him at WRT, as his presence has been deeply felt by generations of clergy at the temple and indeed has touched the congregation. He's spoken at WRT many times. Very, very close friendships with the clergy of the temple and partnership with our emeritus Rabbi Rick Jacobs, president of the Union for Reform Judaism. So Rabbi David Ellenson, dead at the age of 76. May his memory be for a blessing. This morning, we return in our study, having had a little appetizer portion of Chanukah cheer last week with my friend and colleague, Rabbi Jeff Middleman, whose presence and scholarship I hope you enjoyed. It was really just a chance for you to meet this wonderful rabbi whose course called Judaism on the Vanguard of the Future will be offered in January and February. A 5-week mini course, details of which are found in the Temple Bulletin, on the website, in the weekly e-blast. All you need to do is make sure you read your emails. Every Thursday, the Temple sends out word of all the stuff that's coming up over the next 2 weeks. You'll be receiving word of that class. Registration will be provided through a jot form link. He's using his Zoom room, so you will need to register separately for the class. But everybody who is enrolled, meaning you get the weekly messages from Natalie for this class, at which point I kind of do a brief executive summary of our learning and a link to the YouTube channel where I upload our recorded classes. Everybody who's already enrolled in getting those messages from Natalie, usually on a Friday or a Monday, you will receive a direct email invitation to enroll for Rabbi Middleman's midwinter class. Others, if you're not enrolled, if you don't get the weekly updates from Natalie, all you need to do is just touch base with the office, or as I said, follow our information on eBlast or the website, and you can just enroll so that you have the Zoom link. The class will be taught exclusively over Zoom, 10:15 on Thursday, starting the 5th of January and running, I think it's just consecutive weeks, 5, 12, 19, 26, and the first Thursday in February, whatever date that might be, something like Groundhog Day. Okay. Today we return in our long-form study this fall to the topic that was thrust upon us on October 7th, which is to mine the Jewish tradition for whatever wisdom, guidance, solace, comfort, enlightenment might be found in our sacred text, particularly with a focus on Gemara, and focus on the Babylonian Talmud. Today, I'd like us to do some study around the subject of power and the ethical use of power. And in order to engage that study, we're going to have a few other voices, leading Jewish voices, including Ruth Weiss and Rabbi Daniel Hartman, whose words both in print and video we will have the chance to encounter this morning. But I'd like to begin with what I would call kind of like a classic from the Talmudic literature. So the passage that we are going to look at is from Bavli, from the Babylonian Talmud, tractate Bava Metzia, daf or page 62a. So let's take a look at that passage. I'm going to bring it up on screen now. So this is the passage, and we recited our blessing before I hit the recording this morning. So if you are tuning in for the first time to today's lesson from home and haven't yet recited your blessing, you can do so. 62a from the Babylonian Talmud, tractate Bava Metzia, which means the middle gate. There are 3 tractates in this seder or order of the Talmud, which is, I believe, Nizikin, the order of the Talmud that corresponds to the Mishnaic order, Nizikin, which means damages. So I guess in modern law school parlance, this is the part of the Talmud where you learn about torts. But that's a pretty rough analogy. The laws described, or the Jewish thought contained within this order of Talmud, have to do with how Jewish people live in a wider society and also interact with fellow Jewish people. So we're kind of picking up right in the middle. There are three tractates in this order. The very first three tractates in the order is the larger category. So you've got the whole Mishnah or the whole Talmud. 6 are the orders of the Mishnah, right? So you've got an order that's called Zira'im, which means seeds, and nominally it's about agricultural practices, but it also is where we find all of the tractates about how Jewish people mark sacred time, our festival calendar, Shabbat, and what have you. This order of the Talmud Nizikin, or damages, has 3 opening tractates, each beginning with the word Bava, which means a gate in Aramaic. You've got Bava Kama, which means the first gate, Bava Metzia, the middle gate, and Bava Batra, which means the last gate. So we're looking at Bava Metzia, the middle of the 3 gates of this order of Talmud. And we're picking up right in the middle of the tractate. So we begin with a quote from Vayikra, from the Book of Leviticus, 25, verse 36. It's one of the most quoted lines in all of rabbinic literature. V'chei achicha imach. Okay, that's the actual phrase. The biblical phrase are these 3 words, v'chei achicha, or v'chai achicha imach, meaning your brother shall live with you. We're gonna get to that in its proper context, but I just want you to actually see the part that's being quoted. And then it goes on to say, from which it is derived, return interest to him so that he may live. Ahadar le ki hechi deniche in Aramaic. All right, so what is being described here? Well, on Safaria, very helpfully, if you want to search for a citation of a biblical verse that's being quoted by the later rabbinic text, you just click, and then a sidebar pops up. I didn't mean to, I did that kind of wrong. Let's see, click, there it is. So I'm going to just walk us through this section of the Book of Leviticus, again, chapter 25. I think that the passage begins here in verse 38. Ani Adonai Elohechem, I Adonai am your God, Asher hotzeti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. I'm over here, by the way. You see on the right-hand side. Oopsie, there we go. Every now and then it scrambles where we're looking. Okay, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, me'eretz Mitzrayim, latet lachem, in order to give to you et eretz Canaan, the land of Canaan, lihiot lachem lelohim, in order to be your God. All right, so that's the opening of this section, this new passage. Now, here is the specific case being discussed. If your kin under you continue in straits. So the situation that is being described is a fellow Israelite. We believe that is the usual sense that is connoted by the Hebrew word ach, this word here. Achicha is the word brother plus the singular possessive suffix. So achicha is your brother, your family member, your clansman or kinsman or kinsperson. The gender norms here are that, yes, it is conjugated as it's denoted as a masculine singular, but it probably just means a fellow member of the Jewish people, irrespective of gender. So if a fellow Israelite, if a fellow Jew, I hate that it keeps doing that, continues to be in straits, yamuch, if he's in dire need. He's needy, he's disadvantaged, he is poor, so much so that he has indentured himself to you as a slave, right? And I think that if you've been studying with me for a long period of time, this will not be the first time we've discussed slavery within the Israelite community. We're not talking about our historic or our mythical narrative of having been slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, where the main thrust of that narrative is to describe the privation and abuse of being a slave to Pharaoh. Having said that, you would think that once the Israelites were freed from Egyptian bondage, they got into the wilderness, they settled in the promised land, and they abolished slavery outright. That's not actually what happened. What we know, beyond the shadow of a doubt, is we don't have any evidence that we were actually slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. We have massive evidence that Jewish people or Israelites kept slaves, because all ancient Near Eastern peoples kept slaves. And the dominant condition of slavery, or the dominant precipitating circumstance of slavery, is that a fellow Israelite would be indentured in your home, your household, as a servant, having incurred staggering debt, or debt out of which one could not redeem oneself except through indentured servitude. We use these words indentured servitude, though the Hebrew doesn't distinguish between servitude and slavery. So it is legal slavery throughout the Israelite civilization in antiquity. So the situation being described is one such person. V'nim karlach, and he literally has been sold to you. Here it says, and must be given over to you, but that actually softens what the Hebrew really says. So I'm giving I think a more faithful, sharper translation, sharp both in the sense of accuracy, but also sharp in the sense of you might feel this if you have stored up feelings about slavery and slavery being bad. Then you'll struggle with this text. A person has been sold to you. Lo ta'avod bo avodat aved. Nevertheless, you must not rule over him, or you must not have him serve you with the service of a slave. Right? So it's interesting. The condition that's being described is a person who's been sold to you as a slave, but you must not treat him as a slave. So and we could get into this in a much longer way, and maybe we'll have a chance to revisit some of these thoughts when we get closer to Pesach. But my own conjecture, which has, I think, grown stronger in my confidence to say this publicly, the longer I've been studying this material and the more I've read about this material, I'm not convinced that we, the Jewish people, were ever slaves to a pharaoh in Egypt. I think the evidence is really lacking for that, though it's an incredibly important story. I think that one of the main drivers for our national myth, our national origin story, being rooted in slavery and not in glory, right? The origin story of the Jewish people begins in degradation and ends in praise of God. That actually is the line that the Talmud teaches us about how to conduct a Passover Seder. It says you begin in degradation and end in praise. So you begin by retelling the story of our ignominious origins as a slave people to a ruthless pharaoh. You tell that story. By the time you've had 4 cups of wine, you're singing around a table, Hallel. You're ending in psalms of praise to God as the Redeemer. I believe that rather than deriving from a historical experience of the Jewish people in Egypt, I actually think that the Pesach story is a long-form narrative drama that communicates a core value, or the core value, of the Jewish mindset or the Jewish ethos, which is that we must not oppress each other, or we must not oppress the vulnerable. And the way in which that actually comes about historically is through the condition of debt slavery. This is a known condition pervasively throughout ancient Israelite history. The Torah expends great amounts of ink. The whole most of the end of the Book of Leviticus and the whole 15th, 16th chapter of the Book of Deuteronomy are all about this. How you treat a person who has indentured himself to you as a slave, or who has been sold to you as a slave. And the way in which we inculcate the value of not oppressing the slave is both through law, as we see in passages like Leviticus 25, but also through narrative, stories like the Exodus from Egypt. Does that make sense? I'm basically saying that the storytelling of the Exodus story serves the larger purpose of communicating an overarching ethos for the Jewish people. Thou shalt not oppress the needy. We know that from the story, but we also know it historically, not necessarily from being slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, but from owning slaves as Israelites in Eretz Yisrael. That's quite a mind shift for you. And I wouldn't blame you if you felt a little bit jostled by what I've just shared with you, by my perspective, and would require some time just to let that sink in. So that's the condition that's being described here. And I think that that preamble is really important for understanding the passage. So I'm scrolling on the right-hand side. Judy, do you want to comment or question here?
What does kin involve? Does kin your familiar, your family kin, or kin the Jewish people, your tribe?
Yeah, the ambiguity of that is really vexing. And there's a lot of debate. There are all sorts of specific terms that are used, particularly in the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, which are mostly law. They're mostly compendia of law, as opposed to Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers, which are mostly narrative. Leviticus and Deuteronomy use a lot of terms to describe the relationships, interrelationships among the Jewish people or the Israelite people, because the term Jewish was not really used until after the Babylonian exile to refer to the Commonwealth of Judah, or the tribe of Judah that was dispersed and then reclaimed in its ancestral territory of Judah, the southernmost tribe of ancient Israel, and actually a kingdom unto itself, together with the much smaller tribe of Benjamin. So I call these people Israelites, but Judeans, or soon to be known as Jews. So there are terms that apply only to that community. And ach, which means brother, probably means that. It means your fellow Israelite, all 12 tribes. But again, we're not sure what Israelite identity was. We are pretty sure that it actually changed over time, right? Was it a national identity? Was it more of a tribal identity? Was it even smaller, like a clan or a family identity? Ach could probably mean all of those things, but I'm going to assign to ach the largest of those categories, meaning it refers to all people who are Israelite. Israel and Judah, the ancient kingdoms that comprise the largest kingdom of the Jewish people. What it means is not a Gentile, not a person who's not part of our ancestral community. But more than that, I can't answer. I think it's a great question, Judy. But you know that when the same book of Leviticus, 6 chapters prior, in Leviticus 19 declares, or 18 rather, 7 chapters earlier, no, 19 verse 18, Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your rea as yourself. Well, who is your rea? Rea can mean neighbor, kin, fellow, friend. And there's an unresolved debate in the rabbinic literature between rabbis who define love your neighbor as yourself, meaning only your fellow Jew, right? But anyone who's not Jewish is not included in that category, and therefore may be correctly subject to different or lesser treatment. There are other rabbis who interpret the verse and that one word in a much more universalistic light and say, no, your neighbor means any other human being, right? And I think the Jewish people are still wrestling this. And this is not, I'm going at some length into this rabbit hole because I really think that these are conversations that the Jewish people are having right now about who is our brother, who is our ally, who is our neighbor, who is our friend, right? Who do we have to look out for? These are actually directly related to today's study. And they're unresolved in the Talmud. I think you can take and be an accurate reader of the text. You can take a more narrow or particularistic read and say the neighbor, the brother, means just your fellow Jew. God forbid there are Jews who, by the way, read it even more narrowly. And they'll say, Reform Jews, for instance, are outside of that category because they have violated the tradition. So the Re'ah refers to an even smaller category, though I think these days there's a strong enough sense that we know who the Jewish people are. And Israel, for instance, had a fairly maximalist definition of who is a Jew for the purpose of law of return. It was anyone with one Jewish grandparent. The reason Israel adopted that standard, and this is back, shortly after declaring independence, Ben-Gurion insisted that a Jew would be defined for the purpose of repatriating Israel as an independent country as anyone with one Jewish grandparent, which was the same standard that Hitler had used in Nuremberg in 1935, right? So it was intended to undo the Nazi doctrine of who is a Jew, where you had people, if any of you have seen Leopoldstadt, part of the horror of that story that's being told is that the people who were sent to their deaths in the Holocaust, many of them were barely identified as Jews. Like they really had assimilated into secular Christian Viennese or German society. The story of Leopoldstadt is centered around a family in Vienna. The opening scene of that play is decorating a Christmas tree. It's a Jewish family decorating a Christmas tree. So, it speaks to a historic condition of the Jewish people that, well, we may define ourselves one way and others may define ourselves another way. So who is your ach? We don't know. But here's the idea. You've taken this slave, but you can't treat him like he's your slave. Verse 40. Remaining with you as a hired or bound laborer, they shall serve with you only until the Jubilee year. So Leviticus envisions in a utopian way, meaning we're not sure if this vision for biblical society was actually ever implemented, but it is the vision that the Torah provides, that there will be a release of slaves, a release of indentured servants every 50th year. Then they, along with any children, shall be free of your authority. They shall go back to their family and return to their ancestral holding, for they are my servants. And it's nice that they capitalize that for us, but of course, Hebrew has no capitalization. My meaning God is the speaker here, whom I freed from the land of Egypt. They may not give themselves over into servitude. Do you see how the narrative of Egyptian bondage and redemption serves the larger purpose of inculcating a value for Israelite slaveholders? All right? We've been taught that the main purpose of the Exodus is to recount our origin story. And I think these days, a lot of us are going to have Passover Seders where we say, never again, we have to stand up to every Pharaoh, and Hamas is Egypt, and all of those. But there's something deeper here. The Exodus story, I think, is most often deployed as a narrative device to inculcate the value of how you are to treat a person who is in dire straits. It's a really different way of understanding how slavery functions in the Israelite collective memory, the Jewish collective memory. All right, you shall not rule over them ruthlessly. The word is befarech. Sounds a little like Pharaoh. That's just a coincidence. It doesn't have anything to do with the word Pharaoh. But farech means with cruelty. And it is a word that comes up in the Pesach story to describe Pharaoh. So again, don't be a Pharaoh is the message here. But rather, v'yareta me'elohecha. You have only one ruler whom you must obey, and that, of course, is God. Now, moving on here, it goes on to a lot of the different details about this, but that's the context for this. Now, prior to that, we're talking about, well, how would a person get into debt in the first place? I'm deliberately working backward here. So here's the situation. If your kin, being in straits, comes under your authority, literally umata yado, like you have a staff in your hand that is the staff of discipline for this person. Vehechezaktabo, and literally, like from chazak, you have power over him. Remember, I told you a while ago, today's lesson is about power. You have power over this individual, ger v'toshav, and you are treating them like they are resident aliens. V'chayimach, let them live with you. Very challenging to translate this and understand it in a 21st century context. Al tikach, so what does that mean? let him live with you. The Torah explains, Al tichach me'ito neshech v'tarbi. Do not exact from him advance or accrued interest. Two different kinds of interest, right? One, basically, a neshech literally means to take a bite. So extracting from him collateral or from his wealth, what little he may have, or during the period of one's being with you as a servant or a slave, accumulated interest, you're not allowed to. So from this comes a principle that you're probably familiar with, which is that Jews are not actually allowed to charge other Jews interest according to Torah law. Now, there are going to be many workarounds in the rabbinic period. And of course, it is exactly the ability to differentiate, or the willingness to differentiate between how you treat a fellow Jew and how you treat a Gentile, that allows Jews to become known as, or to develop the practice of money lending at interest to non-Jews during the Middle Ages, which actually is the foundation of modern banking. So yes, Jews really did invent modern banking through lending at interest. In a strange and interesting irony, Christians were also not allowed to lend at interest according to their religious doctrine. Considered ignoble, they let Jews do it, which is why Jews became the money lenders. But of course, Jews became both reviled in society and also essential to the economic operation of medieval societies. This is why when Spain kicked out all of its Jews in the late 15th century, its banks collapsed, right? Its economy collapsed. It was devastating for non-Jewish people in Spain. Should have kept your Jews. Anyway, do not lend money at advance interest, nor give food at accrued interest. So that's the principle here. The verse that is being picked up in the Talmud, so now jumping back to the Gemara, is V'chei achicha imach. Let your kin live by your side as such. They are still your kin. I'm going to stop here. We spent a long time. We spent a half hour just on literally one verse of Leviticus. But I would like to ask if there are any questions just about what's being discussed here, and then let's see what the Talmud does with it. Okay, hearing none, I'll return to the Talmud passage now. So this is the verse from Torah, and here is how the Gemara treats the text. All right. The Rabbi Yochanan, hi v'chei achicha imach. So Rabbi Yochanan, what does he do with this verse, and your brother shall live with you? The Gemara answers, he requires the verse for that which is taught in a baraita. So Rabbi Yochanan is going to use this verse to elucidate a baraita, which you will recall is an extra Mishnaic teaching coming from the earlier period of rabbinic law that is brought into the discussions of the Talmud. And this is the baraita. So the baraita gives a very famous case example. If two people were walking on a desolate path, I don't know why it has to be desolate, except that Steinsaltz wants you to know there's nobody else around. By the way, I give this ethical dilemma to my high school students all the time and ask how they would solve it. So two people are walking on a path, and there is a jug or a kiton of water in the possession of one of them. So one of them has like a canteen. And the situation was such that if both drink from the jug, both will die. That's the other reason you have to know that it's desolate. So they're walking in the desert, and the water is the only thing that's going to keep them alive. But there's only enough water in the canteen that if both of them drink from it and split the water, they both will die. It's not enough for both of them. And the situation was such that if both drink, both will die. There is not enough water. But if only one of them drinks, he will reach a settled area, right? There's enough water to get one person to safety. All right, now I've deliberately put the text off because we're going to do a choose your own adventure. So this is the dilemma. And don't worry, there are no wrong answers. And in fact, we'll see that a very famous machloket, or divergence of opinion, a debate ensues. So what should you do? You're walking on a path, you're in a desolate area with one other person. You've got a canteen of water. If both of you drink from the canteen, you both will die. If one of you drinks, you make it to safety. What's the right thing to do? No cheating if you already know the answer. If you already know this passage, don't raise a hand. Let's have some fun here. Okay, Rob, what do you think? Rob and Aaron.
Well, personally, I would say give it to the youngest person.
Tell us your reasoning. I'd like to hear you think through this like a rabbi.
I'm thinking that the youngest person has the most life left to live and the most to give to the world.
Great. Let's assume that from the lacuna here, from the fact that the Talmud doesn't tell us any information, that the two people are exactly the same age, they're exactly in the same condition of life, they have exactly the same family configuration, and you can't tell who has more or better life ahead of him or her. Let's assume that. And so Rob, yes, Rob's saying, well, I would look for other conditions that make it clear why one person deserves to live more than the other. In this case, age might be a great index of that, because the young person, again, has a lot more life ahead of him or her. And in a natural world, especially if it's like a father and a child, the natural order of things, the emotional order that we seek in life is that parents should never have to bury their children, where it is a natural part of life that children should bury their parents. So better for the older person to die. I get that. But that information is not provided. And so we must assume that rather than being unequal, the two people are exactly the same. Okay, I saw Michelle's hand first or next.
Of course, having had lots of training in economics, I want to assume away problems or call all, and you are of course trying to call all else equal. And I generally don't like these kinds of questions, but what I would do is to share it, because as Hagar experienced when she and Ishmael were wandering the desert, you never know what's going to happen, and perhaps something will come to rescue, and that increases the odds for both of you.
Great.
And maybe you will have just enough life in you to drag yourselves to the outskirts of a settlement.
Right. Yeah, always hoping for a deus ex machina. That's very Jewish too, by the way. There's the famous joke about, it is announced the world's top climate scientists have determined that there's going to be a massive flood that will put Noah's flood to, like, it'll look like nothing. It'll look like a drop in the bucket, literally. And so the great faith leaders of the world all get their, time on the air to announce to their faithful what to do. And the Pope gets on and says, faithful Christians all over the world, now is the time to accept Jesus in your hearts as your savior, so that when you die, in the flood, we will all be resurrected unto eternal life. And, the Dalai Lama gets on there and says, all life is suffering. This is only part of the great flow of existence. You must accept this, and you will attain nirvana. And then the chief rabbi of Jerusalem gets on and he says, Yidden, we have 3 days to learn how to live underwater. Right, okay, so yeah, we're always looking for a way out. That's very Jewish too. Let's take Peggy's comment next. Unmute yourself, please. All right, while Peggy's unmuted, I see my mom and dad have a hand raised, so we'll take you next, and then Peggy will be with us.
There
she is.
You give it to the person who seems to be the healthiest and strongest, who could get to the town and bring back help to the other person. Great,
right? Again, a very Jewish way through the text. The only problem is, like, Michelle said, well, this is what economists do all the time. They need to assume certain conditions that allow you to solve problems with variables that aren't really there, right? My favorite, I have another joke about this. Indulge me, will you? It's been a hard morning. So a mathematician, a physicist, and an economist find themselves trapped at the bottom of a well, empty of water. Nevertheless, they're in a real pickle. And they're like, oh man, how did we get in this situation? They look up, it's just a vast chasm. There's no way they're getting out of the well. And finally, they kind of huddle together and say, you know what? We're three of the smartest people we know. If anyone can figure out a way out of this well, it's got to be, we should be able to get out of this well. And the mathematician says, I'm on it. He goes off into, I was going to say like a corner. I guess a well doesn't have corners, but he goes off by himself, and he takes out his little notepad and he scribbles a bunch of equations, and he comes back an hour later and he says, well, my dear friends, sadly, I've concluded mathematically that there is no way to escape from the well. The physicist says, see, amateurs, you don't know anything about quantum probability. And he goes off by himself and scribbles a bunch of stuff. And he comes back 12 hours later and he says, well, I regret to inform you, my colleagues, that there's a 0 quantum probability of getting out of this well alive. The economist says, come on, you guys need to think like an economist. So he goes off for 5 minutes. He comes back and he says, my friends, I know how we're getting out of the well. And everybody's ecstatic. They're like, they're elated. Wow. How? The economist says, okay, first, assume a ladder. Okay, that's the joke. Mom and Dad, you're on.
Well, I was going to say from Deuteronomy, choose life that you may live. I can't think of a circumstance in which 2 deaths is preferable to only 1 death.
Great. Beautiful. So now we've heard a few different points of view, all rooted in either Torah or I would just say good Jewish thinking. Good using, Yiddish Kopf doesn't mean that your head is Jewish by birth. It means you're thinking in a way that the rabbis themselves would have appreciated. Barbara, you're going to be the last comment, then we're going to read what the rabbis have to say here.
If they split the water in both getting equal parts, and they believe in God, just like Hagar, who all of a sudden sees a well that an angel has provided, God has provided, maybe there'll be a well.
Right. Okay. So, but through faith, all things are possible. I would have to say that is not a dominant position in rabbinic literature. Mm-hmm. You know what the Talmud says about what happens when a person gets sick? The Talmud says, see a doctor. Right? Really, that's actually a line from the Talmud. It says, when a man is sick, go see a doctor. It's one of my favorite lines because I think it says so much about the rabbinic ethos, like the rabbinic mindset is idiot. It's like the, I won't tell a third joke. It's the one about I sent a rescue boat and I sent a helicopter and okay, you know that one? All right, yeah, look it up. It's a good one, right? No, God will provide. Idiot. I sent a boat. I sent a helicopter. Okay, anyway.
No, you got to tell it. You got to finish the story now.
No, I can't tell it as well as you, Joe. Okay, here we go. Okay, so here's what happens. So you have the path. You've got the canteen. If you drink, both will die. There's not enough water. But if only one of them drinks, he will reach a settled area. Now, there is a dispute as to the halacha, right? The rabbis argue over, well, what is the law? What must you do? Ben Petorah, who is Ben Petorah? Well, let's find out. You just click on his name. Nope, they don't have a bio for Ben Petorah. I guess he's just one of the many, many, many rabbis quoted in the Gemara. He said, it is preferable that both of them drink and die and let neither one see the death of the other. Right? How can you make this choice? How can you choose one life over another? That was the accepted opinion until Rabbi Akiva came along and he taught something different. This is a fascinating machloket. He says, the verse states, and your brother shall live with you. Now, I'm gonna stop for just a moment. So remember what that verse means in its original context. In its original context, it means that if a person who is your brother, meaning a fellow Jew, has been sold to you as a slave, you may not treat him ruthlessly. Where the word ruthless isn't so much about physical abuse, it's actually about economic abuse that would force that person to be your slave in perpetuity by mechanisms of accrued or advance interest, right? That's the idea, that economics actually is the big driver of slavery. This is an astonishing insight and one that is not actually only commenting on antiquity. The dominant slavery is alive and well, my friends, in today's world, and it is largely a condition that is related to economics. There's also sexual slavery, but generally, I mean, almost without exception, the young men and women or boys and girls who are kept in sexual slavery do not have means by which they can redeem themselves from that awful condition. Sometimes they're there also under physical duress. But in many cases, it is economic distress or duress that forces people in the world to be servants or slaves to masters. Right? That is a really important, I think, Jewish way of looking at the world. That power is unequally distributed. It is not allocated in a way that is equitable or just, and that produces a condition of ongoing slavery. The Torah says that given that that is the actual fact of human society, that's the way of the world, the Jewish law, the Israelite law, the Torah law, is that you can't take advantage of that and perpetrate or perpetuate abuse within that norm, which is already kind of an accepted norm. The verse may seem to have nothing to do with a jug of water. Akiva says, here's what the verse really means. And I think that in some ways it is linked to my dad's understanding of another famous verse that uses the word chai, to live, that it is a Jewish overriding law or value to choose life, and that it is better for one person to live than for both to die, right? That in the very cold calculus of life and death in this situation, better that one lives rather than both of them die. Akiva goes even one step farther to identify who should live and who should die. And before we get to it, and he uses it because he finds this verse in Leviticus that says, let your brother live with you. It's going to be a really creative and strange, it's going to be a little bit hard for us to get through what it means, but I'll help you. How do you decide who lives? So let's assume that we know one thing, which is it's better for one to live than for both to die. Then it's only a matter of who. Now remember the circumstance, right? I'm not going to repeat it for you. I'm going to ask you to think about the text that we've studied and remember all of the important details. How do you decide who lives and who dies? If you accept that Akiva is right. Right? And again, the text doesn't give us what some of us wanted, which is a clear way of differentiating who is more deserving. Rob spoke about that. I think Judy Gross spoke about that. We would love for there to be a clear indicator of who's more deserving. So the answer is the text actually does tell us who's more deserving. Judy?
Who's holding the water?
Thank you. Now let's look at Akiva. And your brother shall live with you, indicating that your life takes precedence over the life of the other. In other words, the key word is not so much brother or life. The key word is with, im, imach, which connotes dependency. You have the water, right? It says there was a jug of water in the possession of one of them. One has the water. It is a different scenario if two people are walking in the desert and they both at the exact same time stumble upon a canteen of water, and then the scenario unfolds. That would be a very different ethical calculus according to Akiva. In this scenario, I'm walking through the desert with a friend, and I just happen to have provisioned myself for the journey by taking my canteen of water. According to Akiva's read, I should drink the water and live. Joe?
My question before making any kind of an answer would be, originally, what's the reason for one holding the water?
Now you know, because it's a thought exercise. And the rabbis are here to teach a larger point about power, about in the real world, ethical dilemmas arise in which it's not easy to know who is right and who is wrong. An ethical dilemma isn't about an easy choice where one is right or one way is right and one is wrong. An ethical dilemma is where you have two things that are good, but they are in irresolvable conflict with one another, right? In this case, they literally they up the ante to the max by making it a situation where it's literally life and death. But the thing that Akiva wants you to appreciate is that there is a power differential between the two of them. The same way there's a power differential between the master and the slave. One is dependent on the other. It is the Jewish principle that, yes, we should not abuse the person without power, but at the end of the day, it does not teach us that we should relinquish power, particularly if our own lives are at stake. Now, do you see why I chose this text to talk about Israel? In my view, Israel is, ever since the founding of the state of Israel and its significant efforts to develop a militia, a military power that made it the dominant military power in the region and one of the great military powers of the world. The question is no longer, how can Israel treat others by giving up power, which has been the Jewish historical condition for most of the Jewish people, most of our history, right? We haven't had power. Now that we have power, I say we, I mean the state of Israel, but the state of Israel is the state of the Jewish people. Israel is not for us foreign policy. Israel is our state. We are citizens of the United States. Some of us may have dual citizenship, but if anyone who is Jewish by Hitler's standard wanted to move to Israel tomorrow, we'd be welcomed back under the law of return. So Israel is our state. It is the state of the Jewish people. Jewish ethics would not ask us to relinquish power, particularly in a conflict with an enemy that is sworn to the destruction of the Jewish people and the Jewish state. The object here is not how to accomplish Israel's aims and remain an ethical nation or an ethical power by relinquishing power. It is now and always a question of how to use power ethically. How does Israel use its significant power ethically, particularly when any war that Israel fights with the Palestinians, and I'm not going to include Hezbollah, which has a much more significant ballistics arsenal, and I'm certainly not going to include a country like Iran, which really does or aspires to have the capacity to annihilate Israel, where it's very different. But when Israel fights the Palestinians, even a Hamas that is capable of inflicting what it inflicted on October 7th, there's not a scenario where Hamas can actually achieve on its own a military victory and eradicate the Jewish state. Therefore, Israel is forced in fighting Hamas to participate in asymmetric warfare, in which Israel has power that the Palestinians do not. That's a fact on the ground. And we're going to get to some of the words I promised by Ruth Weiss and Daniel Hartman, that I think you have to acknowledge the power differential. But where I differ from so-called pro-Palestinian protesters, most of whom are anti-Israel protesters, and there is a difference, because I see myself as pro-Palestinian. I also see myself as pro-Israel. The idea is not for Israel to reduce its share of power, but rather to exercise its power in a way that is ethical. But when it's a matter of life and death, how does one do that? Akiva says, well, you drink the water and your fellow, the one with less power, dies. But at least you're not both dead. That is a cold calculus that many people are not prepared to make. Particularly, I think in the last many years, but particularly in left-thinking circles, academia in particular, and those who have adopted a kind of intersectional document or intersectional theory of how the world works, which is all about power and the asymmetry of power. There, I believe, is a morally dangerous argument that is being advanced on the left that power is inherently evil, and that the more power an actor or a state or an organization has, the more it is morally culpable, or not just morally culpable, the more it is bad, and that powerlessness is being equated with virtue. So that in the power differential, if Israel's here and the Palestinians are here, the way the left is interpreting that dynamic is like this. Therefore, as a direct correlation, the Palestinians being less powerful or unempowered or disempowered are actually higher in the scale of virtue. This equation that's being made, I believe, is morally dangerous. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say and why we're studying this text, right? And how it all pertains. And we've made a lot of exegetical and intellectual leaps here. You have to really connect some dots from a verse in Leviticus, which has to do with indentured servitude and loaning at interest, all the way to what you do when it's life and death, and how you know who deserves to live and who deserves to die. And what Akiva is basically saying is you can't give up the water. Yes, to save a life is the holiest mitzvah in all of Judaism, but you can't give up the water if it means you yourself will die. And you, the one holding the water, has the power. How you exercise it, however, is where the subtleties of ethical discourse come into play. Okay, let's take a few questions in the order I see them. I saw Rob and Aaron, and then the hand dropped. Did you have a question? Okay, Mom and Dad, you're up. And then I see Ruth's hand. You'll go next.
As you know, John, Mom and I have been catching up on West Wing, a series which we never saw before, but
so good.
Enjoying tremendously. And a lot of the situations really, of course, were written to echo real life events. And in the episode we watched yesterday, I think from the middle of season 4, the setup was that there was a massacre going on in some unnamed African country. And President Bartlett has been wrestling with the idea of, to save these, 15,000 slaughtered Burundis, should he send in American troops at the peril to the American troops? And he asked one of his speechwriters, if I don't send them in, does that mean that the Burundi lives are worth less than American lives? Why is that? And the speechwriter thinks about it for a minute and he says, I don't know why that is, but it is. And I think one of the ethical dilemmas that, underlies a lot of this is, what is the value of the Palestinian lives? We're not talking about the lives of the Hamas terrorists, but what are the lives worth of the Palestinians compared to how we value the lives of the Israelis? I have no answer for that question, but it certainly did ring a chime.
Great. Rob and Aaron, thank you.
I guess it's a half question, half comment, but nowhere in this does Rabbi Akiva say that the other person deserves to die, just that he must for the other one to live. And I think that's a distinction as well. I don't think we have to argue who deserves to live and who deserves to die. But like you said, the fact is one will for the other to live. And I think that speaks to the value, like what you were saying, Doug. The value may be equal, but the fact still remains one has to die for the other to live. And so
excellent summary. Excellent. I'm going to take Ruth, who I said was next, and I see Judy last, and then I see Russell and Mark.
Well, for me, it's a real dilemma. We used to do the Friendly programs were ethical dilemmas where two rights come in conflict. And when you talk about the decision really being based on power, then for me, it takes it out of the ethical realm. Because
Right, and I recognize the discomfort of that. And I'm going to own that. I'm going to own that that's exactly what I'm doing. But of course, I'm just a messenger here. I'm just here to bring the Jewish tradition. I believe that Jewish ethics force us to be responsible for our own power, and that it is not a good thing that the Jewish people had become so accustomed to powerlessness that it governed most of our way of life for 2,000 years after the diaspora began, and continue to vex us. Like, I really believe that the world is fine with Jews so long as we don't have power. And the minute we have power, the world has a big problem with Jews. And by the way, anti-Semitism is a vast interlocking network of conspiracy theories, all of which have to do with the unacceptable condition that is, in the eyes of the anti-Semite, of a Jew or the Jewish people and their power. And I believe that the key or the goal here, what Judaism teaches us, is how to wield and exercise our power ethically, not that we achieve virtue by relinquishing power, nor, by the way, are we invited or permitted to arrogate undue power unto ourselves. But I really think that developing a relationship, a healthy embrace of our own power, is warranted by our Jewish tradition, and it is especially warranted by the present moment. But Ruth, thank you so much for sharing that. And I want to wish you, by the way, a mazel tov on the arrival of your 5th great-grandchild last Friday morning.
Yeah.
Mazel tov.
Yeah, there was one line Fred had. You may have a right to do something, but is it the right thing to do?
That's a great line.
Yeah.
And may Fred's memory be blessed as he is in your own heart, in your own life, in your own family. That's beautiful. Okay, let's take Judy last, Russell, and
yeah, I was thinking, having taught history for many, many, many years, there is the issue of power. Obviously, when you talk about take your brother in, but don't charge him anything, don't accrue, etc., and so forth. When you take your brother in, you need to think about how you're going to treat the person you took in, whether he not be your brother or whether you have conquered an area like the British did. So what can you do? You can try to use your power correctly. And so although the British were a tough imperialistic country, they weren't comparable to how awful it was to be conquered by Spain. They brought in trains, they brought in medicine, they brought in education. I'm not any way at all, saying that's fine. The real issue when you said it is people do have power, people don't have power. I think it's how you utilize your power. If the Arab people during the Palestinians in 47 to 49, when they gave up their property because they were told to get off the land so that they could finish the job that Hitler started, and came back as refugees, I don't think they came back powerless and being treated badly. I think that time and evolution of different peoples sometimes changes the basic purpose of the power. But I think that's an important thing to understand.
And by the way, I'm so glad you raised this, because really these dynamics animate the ongoing bitter Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, and for Palestinians, what happened from 48 to 49, what we call the War of Independence, they call variously the War for Palestine or the Nakba, the catastrophe, because they lost that war. And many fled at the direction of their own Arab leaders, and many were expelled by the IDF, and many were killed, and some were killed in what we would call just war circumstances, and some may have been killed in what we would call war crimes. Maybe there are Israeli historians who believe that any and all of the above is part of the story. as happens in any war. But the Palestinians continue to relate to what happened in 1948, 1949 as a gross injustice, and that the Jews arrogated power unto themselves that they did not rightfully have, to expel them from land that was rightfully theirs. That, of course, is not the Jewish narrative, but Judy, you kind of acknowledge that by saying, with the passage of time, narratives and national identities actually evolve. So you actually don't have a Palestinian national movement until the 60s, but it pertains to something that had happened a decade and a half earlier. And that even is pretty early, right? Well, I want to suggest the Jewish national identity as a former oppressed slave people to a pharaoh in Egypt probably evolved centuries